Hi, Justice fans. Today we're talking the Bobbi Kristina Brown judgment, Officer Spaghetti Brain, and so much more.
You are tuned into Black Hollywood Lives. Justice is served.
Hello and welcome to Justice is Served. My name is Chelsea Galicia. Thank you for joining me and my co-hosts, Shaka Strong. Oop, no, there. I flubbed it up for the first time in like a year. Shaka Smith, who you can find. Social media, Shaka Strong. And Yemi has returned. Yemi Abayomi, thank you so much for being here. We missed you both last week on our pre-Thanksgiving show, and we had some awesome co-hosts take over for you guys. I hope you enjoyed that. A WWE wrestler and a stand-up comedian filled in for you guys.
Oh, nice.
They did a fabulous job. I think you would be proud. Today we have a very random roundup of legal stories, and I guess the only thing to do is to get into them. Thanks for joining us this week, and let's do this because we could be here for quite a while if we took our time with each story, but let's just get to it. So normally we start off with like the celebrity story, but we're going to start off right now with another story that I think makes a great context for the celebrity story that we're going to cover today. So the celebrity story is Bobbi Kristina Brown, the judgment that came out, which actually came out last week, but I held off on talking about this story until this week because I wanted to talk about it with you guys. Just really briefly, she obviously died, and Nick Gordon was found responsible, and then the judgment was for $36 million. Okay, so that's the update with that, but we're going to put that to the side a little bit and talk about this article that came out in the Washington Post called "In One Corner of the Law, Minorities and Women Are Often Valued Less," and this was by Kim Soffin. What do you guys think of this article?
I thought it was interesting because it's something that we all knew that, you know, when we calculate damages, it's kind of based on what that person would have earned, and a lot of times they use those tables. They look at race and gender.
Yeah, it's not even that they're like kind of, sort of in there. I mean, they are at front and center. This race and gender used to figure out how much basically somebody's life is worth.
Yeah, and as you know, as attorneys in law school, we're kind of trained to look at that and accept that as that is what you do to calculate these sort of damages.
Well, in my mind, it's economic damages, right?
Yeah.
Loss of earning capacity and things like that. But it just didn't occur to me how much race is used and gender. I mean, some of the stories in here were kind of mind-boggling.
It is. I mean, kudos to you. I actually didn't even think about the fact that race and gender would be used in those types of calculations. I thought it would be strictly, you know, what's this person's educational level? What has their historical earning capacity been? How can we project it into the future? I never thought for a second that their race would even be a part of the calculation or that their gender would be a part of the calculation.
I didn't. One of the stories in the article was about a 6-year-old boy whose parents were very well educated, and he had been exposed to lead as like a baby, and so he was is never going to hold down a real job because he acts out and he's really kind of out of control due to this lead poisoning. And the attorney for the family was arguing that he should get about $3.5 million. And the attorneys for the landlord said, that's too high because the kid is Hispanic and they don't have a great rate of graduate degree rates, and so it should be maybe $1.5 million.
And fortunately, in this case at least, the judge kind of shut down that argument and said, I don't want that in my court, using that as a metric. However, if you still look at like economics or economists, or why can't I say it? Economists' analyses, their analytics, they still incorporate that data.
The jury instructions, the jury, the tables have that baked into them.
Already in there. So even if you're not introducing that information
explicitly,
it
still is in there.
Right, it's still there in the information that the jurors are considering when they're making that.
Well, I think it's certainly a balancing test because there is something to be said for accuracy and fairness. Because you do have to, if someone has to pay economic damages for you know, a loss of, you know, future economic employment or whatever it may be, you want that to be a very accurate number. And quite frankly, they have to take race and gender into account to a certain degree when you're figuring that out when it comes to, you know, what you might earn in the future.
I think that more personal factors should go into it.
Even though it's, I mean, because you look
Race
at
is
it,
just
factual.
way too.
Even
I mean, like
speaking of-
Hispanics. I mean, even a judge was it in that case or another case was like there are Hispanic professors and gardeners. So how do
Exactly.
you use race in that sense to?
Well, you're making
And
your
even if you talk about wanting to be accurate, then you need to be that. Even if you want to be accurate, then you need to take into account the fact that there are some inaccuracies in those initial calculations to
It's
begin
not
with.
even totally
Well-
accurate to base somebody's potential earning capacity on their parents, but that makes a little bit more sense than just race.
And on top of that, some of these economic analyses take into account, let's say, 1970s numbers, where the gender gap, the wage gender gap, is much, much greater back in the
But
1970s than it is now. So
I-
that in and of itself, that foundation is inaccurate for 2016.
Well, yeah, of course, the 1970s. Well, certainly.
But I'm saying that those are the reports that they're using.
But then different economists will use different reports. So you have dueling economists that have different ideas of what people would earn. And so I think the judge and the courts have to, in their fairness, examine what economists is kept presenting a fuller picture. But to say it's not a factor, I think would be inaccurate. Clearly, I'm not saying you should base it solely on race and gender. I'm saying it should be a factor.
But so what do you say to the fact that there are Hispanics who are professors and there are Hispanics who are
Okay, it's
trash
quite
collectors?
when economists make these tables, they don't do it excluding those people. They include them. They include the people that are highly skilled as well. And so those tables are based on a percentage, and it accounts for the population of people they're looking at.
I just can't.
So it
believe,
doesn't
I
mean
can't
they
believe that
go
that would be the
everywhere.
argument to move it from 3.5 million to 1.5. And in the end, the judge found 2 million was appropriate, which I think is low.
Kind of in the middle.
And then, but I don't think it should have been in the middle. And then the landlord, of course, appealed, and then they settled on 1.9. And so this kid is like 5 years old, and he's going to have to be taken care of and live off of $1.9 million for the rest of his life. Anybody else think that that's crazy? I mean, maybe it's a little difficult because I'm thinking of like how far 1.9 million will go in LA, but maybe if this kid lives in another part of the country. Although this happened in New York,
But remember, when we were looking
very
at
expensive there, too.
when we're looking at these damages, we're taking our best guess. No one is saying this kid might not have been the one person to invent the biggest thing in the world. He may have been, but we don't have that data in front of us. All we can do is take our best guess.
And so is it fair to use his race to hamstring him?
No, well, I find it's fair to use it as a factor if we're looking at economic
But that's
damages
what it
in the
ends up
future.
doing. Race, in fact, will hamstring his ability to
To obtain a
higher-
larger
What about
judgment,
the
but-
other
and
example?
that's matter of fact.
But
The
does-
other example of a person, one parent was black and one parent was white. So of course, one set of attorneys was arguing that the kid was white, one set was arguing that the kid was black. I wonder which one was arguing for which.
Well, I
I think it's pretty obvious. That was kind of a sarcastic question.
But I think when you're dealing with a case where you have to look at all the different factors. I would never advocate basing it solely on race or solely on gender. But if you're looking at a basket of factors, including what people make in the marketplace,
But how do you do that even with
That's
like
what these
little
economists
little
are
kids?
trained to do.
One of the stories covered in this article was about a pregnant woman and a 6-year-old girl that were killed in a car crash. And the value of the little girl, the 6-year-old girl, was much less than the male fetus that other woman was carrying.
I mean, when we say it like that, it sounds almost like objectionable.
Terrible.
It doesn't sound.
almost objectionable.
Wow.
Well, but I think valuing life to any economic point is objectionable. But when it comes to these legal cases, we have to do it, and we have economists who are trained to do so. I think certainly we can do a balancing test. We can look at exactly how much they weight race, how much they're weighting gender when they're looking at these things, or do we want to? But if we're going to exclude it, we have to acknowledge they play a factor. We are excluding this because we think it's something like more prejudicial than probative.
I would say that.
And I liked what they said in terms of you're taking past instances of racial discrimination and racial harm, and you're literally projecting them into the future.
Absolutely.
And I agree with that. So do I like that the way we take our accurate? No, I don't think that's the way we should do it. But do I look at it as a valid way to determine economic damages? Absolutely.
No.
But I think we need to.
I think for the good of the public to remove it as a factor.
But we have to acknowledge the fact that it is a factor, and if we're going to remove it, we have to say we just think it's way too prejudicial to do this.
Because we've done it terribly in the past.
Yeah.
And I mean, there has been public outcry about this, only as far as I can tell, when it came to 9/11 victims. Because at first, the amount that families were going to get was going to depend in part on the gender and race of the victims.
Yeah.
And nobody agrees that that was cool, and only people who really knew what was going on called out the fund, and then they changed it to a gender or a race-neutral male that they were going to calculate the damages with. So when people do know that this is going on, they don't agree with it.
Yeah, so I think it should be, I think we should make sort of like a rule or make that sort of effort that we're pushing for fairness. But to say that's not an accurate way to determine damages, I think is incorrect. I think it's an accurate way to determine damages. But I think
even if the underlying information in and of itself is not necessarily accurate?
And I think that's up for debate with different economists. I think the underlying information actually is accurate. It's just we don't like it because it kind
speaks of discrimination
exactly.
and unfairness and lack of equality.
Yeah, but it's still what we have when we're talking about determining economic damages.
No,
so I don't think it should
way
be
too much of an outlying factor.
But then it's something. Then we need to address it in that form rather than say it doesn't play a role or it shouldn't be used. We need to say, look, it does play a role. This is what they would have made, but we think it's an unfair metric to use discrimination as part of the way we look at economic damages.
Ooh, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one because I don't like it being used as a factor. And one place where it does not seem to have been used as a factor at all is in the Bobbi Kristina Brown judgment. So looking at these cases of, a child is rendered virtually unable to take care of themselves for the rest of their life, 1.9 million. Bobbi Kristina Brown passes away, and her family gets $36 million.
Because it was used as a factor, not the only thing, not the only metric.
I do not know how. Now, listen, this was obviously really heavily leaning towards her family because he didn't even show up. He didn't show up in court when he was found responsible, and he didn't show up in court for any part of this process to determine the damages.
I think in any of these cases, no matter what your race or gender is, if you have an estate worth $20 million, you're going to get a larger judgment.
I think it's also
they're going to look at all the factors.
It's also different in this case. I think it's easier to estimate the economic loss for an adult who has a salary history.
But does she really have a salary history of earning income on her own? I don't know that answer.
I don't know either, but I do know that there is a value to having the Houston name. I know that she can trade off of it. She can get more readily than I can. She can get endorsement deals, and I don't know whether she has historically, but she can get endorsement deals. She could. But
that's the thing. That's the thing is there was all sorts of potential, and it's almost okay. Listen, this is the breakdown as I understand it. That there were punitive damages of $250,000. Conversion, basically theft of her money, about $1.5 million. Assault and battery, almost $1.5 million. And pain and suffering as a result of assault, $13.8 million. That still leaves another like $15 million, probably more. Attorneys are notoriously sucky at math, and I'm no different. But there's at least 10 some odd $1 million left in there. That is the assumed loss of earning capacity, economic damages.
And had she probably been a white male, it probably would have been more. I mean, like, women are, underserved in the film industry. They make less than men. And so if a prominent film actress were to, pass away and there was to be a claim, the claim would still be in the millions, but it would probably still be less than what a man would have earned. So they're still using it as a factor.
I think that this amount is obscene. I don't see how it was logically derived at this. I understand
she already
all
had
the
an estate.
potential.
I think she had, didn't she already at the time have millions of dollars?
Yeah, so that money can just be passed on to her heirs, but her earning capacity for just her own self.
But I think earning capacity, they take into account probably how much money you have currently at the time. I think that that certainly impacts your earning capacity.
And I think we would know better whether the $36 million is reasonable if we had a sense of what were her business activities, what type of income was she making, what was she involved in.
And see, that's the thing is, on the stand, Bobbi Brown testified she wanted to go into entertainment and she was going to be a star and that whole thing. But I didn't see that in her lifetime she was making those steps. And so she's actually being given sort of the benefit of the doubt because we could all imagine the potential of somebody
Whoa.
like her. Whereas somebody like a no-name kid that has lead poisoning, we don't imagine all their potential the same way that we do when we know that person's celebrity parents.
Well, we don't necessarily know what her business dealings were, but for instance, there's a lot of these Instagram stars that make tons of money using social media, some millions of dollars a month. Kim
Again,
Kardashian.
something that she possibly could have done, but I didn't see was already happening in her life.
It may
I don't
have
know,
been, but I
maybe
think it may have been. Yeah, I just don't think we were aware
We're
of it.
probably, I mean, I don't view her as a
Yeah, I'm
super,
pretty
super
old.
celebrity.
I'm not that cool, so it's totally possible.
I think a lot of these people probably have some sorts of ventures going on.
That we just
I
aren't.
like, or at least we're more inclined to believe they do, which is
Yeah.
kind of, but to your point, that we're more comfortable with assuming that this person has a higher earning power because her parents are millionaires.
And because she has a lot of money that she's using, and she's out and about, and she's booking this.
So
and
this
booking
is
that.
like the way opposite kind of conclusion. Here is a black female who's awarded $36 million.
I think it would have been higher though had she been a white male. I don't think it's an opposite conclusion. I think it's just
So if
it's
this-
just
if
she
this
happened
had
to be a
been-
lot
it's
wealthier.
like Brad and Angelina's kid.
It would have been, yeah.
Yes, it would have been higher if it was Brad and Angelina's
Yeah,
kid.
absolutely.
But it is amplified by the fact that
She had a large base of money
Yeah.
to begin with and a big name. Yeah.
I do believe that.
So do you think that everybody basically knows that this money is really just symbolic. The award is symbolic because Nick Gordon does not have this kind of money.
It's not necessarily symbolic though, because they can, attach future earnings. So any money that he gets, they may be able to get some percentage of that.
And I think they do intend to garnish his wages.
Good luck trying to get anywhere near $36 million.
Oh yeah, I mean they may not get it,
No.
but certainly for his life, that'll make his life just tougher.
Right. So do you think that the figure $36 million is a fair number?
It's hard to say what. I'm not in that celebrity realm, so I don't know.
And I hadn't really
what their
examined the
potential
case.
income is.
Yeah, and I hadn't examined the case to the point where I felt comfortable knowing that he was responsible. But that's just because I really haven't examined the details of the case.
So Bobby Brown
Well,
still
he hasn't been
wants-
charged criminally.
Exactly.
That
And
is
so
waiting for
was,
that.
yeah.
That is the other part. I mean, I don't know. She has been gone for over 6 months now.
Yeah.
Prior to that, she was unconscious for another 6 months. I mean, this has been about a year.
And I think they're saying that's probably why the criminal charges haven't happened because, when the body was, I guess, essentially healing in the coma, that got rid of a lot of evidence that might have pointed towards his direction.
But I think after this long, they would know if they were going to file charges or not. I mean, I guess it's possible.
I think it's highly doubtable.
At this
that they're
point,
going
I
to press
can't.
charges.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that they would. It has been a while, and you would think that they would have already. And obviously, the standard is going to be higher in a criminal case. And in this civil case, where one, it's just a preponderance of the evidence, and two, they didn't even necessarily present evidence. It was just that he didn't show up, and therefore it was a default judgment.
Right.
So we don't even know how strong.
Well, Bobby
that civil
Brown is
case
still
would have
pushing
been.
for a criminal case, but my sense is that it doesn't look like it's coming.
No,
I don't get
think
the
so.
sense so, and of course a parent's going to want that criminal case because he's just who knows where he is or why, but he's just walking around somewhere with this hanging overhead.
Whew, all right. Now moving on to a very different kind of trial. Let's talk about Dylan Roof. He is the nut job that killed 9 people in a church. And he was about to plead guilty if the prosecution would have agreed to just give him life in prison, but prosecutors want the death penalty, and so now we're in trial. They're in jury selection, but first they had to deal with some, preliminary issues that you have to in this kind of case, including whether this guy was so out of his mind that he can't even be competent to stand for trial, and then he wants to represent himself. What are your thoughts on this?
It was interesting that he wants to represent himself.
It seems that the big crazy murderers are into this thing.
It's not unusual to have people where we question their mental health and their mental stability. It's not unusual for them to choose to represent themselves in order to kind of.
It doesn't generally go well, but okay.
It doesn't go well.
My sense
but the information that could potentially relieve them of some amount of culpability is the exact information they want to hide by representing themselves because they don't want to introduce information about their mental history, even though that's exactly what could
get them off,
Get
or
them
make
off
it
or
easier.
reduce their sentence or make them less culpable.
My sense is that he wants to do this to bolster maybe his prison fame. My sense is he's probably maybe revered in a particular circle in prison.
By Trump fans?
Well, I don't know if I go that far. Well, maybe I would. I don't know.
I mean, before I thought that people like Dylan Roof were a serious outlier. They're just a handful of nut jobs like this, and now I'm not so sure that he's.
I don't know if that's fair, but I do think Dylan Roof is an outlier. Right? Yes, he massacred 9 people in the church, but so I do think he's an outlier. Yes.
I'm just really disturbed that I don't think he's as much of an outlier as I had originally thought, seeing as what the country selected as a president, and then the increase in the number of hate crimes that have gone up since the election. But anyway, I digress. Sorry.
So I'm guessing he's probably revered amongst that circle in prison, and maybe that's why he's okay spending life in prison. And I think this is probably just another opportunity for him to kind of, show off his his wings to that crowd in prison. 'Cause I think he wants to probably cross-examine. I believe there were 3 survivors. He probably wants to cross-examine them. He probably wants to humiliate them or embarrass them.
Awful.
And that for him would bolster his whatever
Disgusting.
it is. Yeah.
This is such a shitty situation because the survivors and will if they face cross-examination, it will be from him asking them directly questions about what happened.
And this was in 2015, and one of them was an 11-year-old girl at the time. So,
and under the 6th Amendment, I mean, he has that right to represent himself, provided that he has the mental capacity. He has that right, regardless of whether it's going to be for the worse for him. That's his right, and therefore those victims or the family members of the victims are going to have to deal with that during trial.
So this is a federal case, and he's facing 33 counts of hate crimes, obviously some of which led to death, obstruction of religion, and firearm charges. And prosecution, of course, is going for the death penalty. So nobody's really anticipating that he's going to be found not guilty. Really, everybody's waiting to see how the penalty phase of this turns out. But it looks like it's going to be a while before we get there because we're still in jury selection, and that itself is expected to take about 2 weeks. Yuck. I just.
But I think he will have counsel, standby counsel there. So.
Yeah.
The legal team that he has now will still be working as advisors.
All right. Well, and a couple of fellows that were convicted this last week, which I think is great news, are a couple of LA sheriff deputies who were found guilty of beating a man with mental illness who is in the prison and then conspiring to cover it up. For me, the issue is, was their jail sentence long enough?
Yeah.
But I don't know if you guys have some thoughts on whether the conviction is sensible in the first place.
Well, I thought the conviction was good, but certainly the jail sentence, they could have faced up to 40 years, and one of them got 21 months and the other one got 5 months.
Yeah, this is to me not a reflection of justice being served. It's really actually very upsetting. And I thought to get a comment from Brian Williams. Remember, he was our guest that came in, who's the executive director of the Oversight Committee on the Sheriffs now. And maybe the next time we have him in, we'll ask him specifically what he thinks of that. But I'm sure he would have a very nice way of answering that. But for me, this is just an outrage. And yes, I understand that one of them was like a Iraqi war veteran. Some hailed him sort of as a hero for showing some discipline, actually, in deciding not to shoot people that had violated a, oh my gosh, what's it called when you're out too late?
Curfew?
Thank you. And then, the other guy was like, oh, this guy was young and immature and he wasn't trained well. And the judge was like, this guy wasn't high up enough to really have much influence. But I'm like, what the?
Especially with this particular case, because they planned this and they were looking for reasons to justify the beating. And then they went and misrepresented documents to make it look as if they had a reason to discipline this person. And so that planning, that level of planning, I thought should have deserved a lot more of a sentence.
This is one of the
Absolutely.
more egregious types of
Yeah.
cases. Sometimes you can kind of pull together the fact that they probably tried to cover it up, but it's not such so clear-cut evidence. But here you have someone who is a whistleblower, essentially,
Yeah.
who came in and testified and said, when I came in, they said, we are going to target this person tomorrow. And then they went and they targeted that person, and then they had to do, clean up the paperwork and cover it up. So it wasn't that, there wasn't a
force or
there wasn't a question of whether or what their actual intent was. I mean, it was very clear what their intent was, and there had been some other incidences of sheriffs, beating up inmates, and those ones got between like 4 and 6 years for sentencing. So to get 2 years or 5 months. Is nothing, and the judge actually mentioned, oh well, does it really matter? Does it really matter how much of a
I thought
sentence
that
you
was
get?
insane.
If is a person really going to be deterred with a 3-year sentence, but they're not going to do it with a
18
5 months?
Yeah.
And the lawyer said, yeah, I actually do think the severity of the sentence is
Yeah.
going to impact whether they think this is something that they should do.
Yeah, so the deputies were named Jason Branham and Brian Brunsting. So they're facing, one of them is 21 months, the other's 36.
5 months.
Oh, 5 months. He is 36 years old, sorry. And this is probably not the most spiritual or enlightened thing that I have said or thought all day, but for me, justice will be served when these guys get their ass kicked in prison. I'll take those as uncomfortable giggles of agreement. And then speaking of our prisons, President Obama still has a chance to commute the sentences of nonviolent drug offenders, and the nonviolent drug offenders whose sentences he's already commuted are urging him, begging him, please do more, because once Trump takes over, these people will likely die in prison for things that if they had been convicted of today, the sentences would be lighter, or in some states, maybe like California, wouldn't have been a crime at all. So any guesses about if or how many more people President Obama will set free?
Well, I think it'll be a lot. I know they're working at a breakneck pace to just push them through and to,
Or they could just do something really crazy and be like, if you were convicted of a non-violent drug offense, you're out. And just instead of doing it one by one. Anybody up for that?
Well,
I like some of the restrictions or the requirements that the Clemency Project has in place. So the DOJ has initiated a Clemency Project geared towards getting these nonviolent offenders out, but there are certain limitations on that. So you have to be serving a federal sentence. It has to be a nonviolent crime. You have to be a low-level person, so you're not involved in organized crime, for example. You've served at least 10 years. You don't have a significant criminal history, and while you've been in prison, you've not been violent while you were in prison, as well as out of prison. So you don't have that history of violence. So, and you have to have had good conduct while you were in prison. So there are some additional things. It can't just be you were nonviolent in this offense that you were jailed for, but you also have demonstrated that you're just a nonviolent person, period. Your history reflects that, and therefore we feel comfortable in that you're not a threat to public safety if we release you.
I like those guidelines, but I'd like to see that 10 years maybe reduced to 1 year, or maybe a percentage of your sentence.
Yeah, I think 10 years is a little bit long time, even if I'm, I've been convicted for a marijuana offense or a crack offense, and I only had a little tablet on me. Do I need to serve 10 years still?
I think maybe like 15% or 20, some percentage of your sentence.
Absolutely.
I guess I'm way more crazy liberal on this. I'm like, I'm on this, like, let more people out, because I think, yes, I like all that, except the energy and time and money and people to go through that whole process seems to be going way too slow. And I guess on the balance of whether you want to let more people out and risk some people who maybe are a higher risk to society versus keeping people in who really do not deserve to be in there. Like, if you've got to pick one evil over the other, I would want more people to go free.
Yeah,
I'm not afraid of these people.
These are our federal prisons, and some have been there like 10 years. My thing is,
and they did commit a crime.
Yeah,
they
so-
did break a law, but I
It's a
agree.
drug crime.
It's a low level crime.
but
I
I
agree.
don't think federal prison is as rehabilitative as we would like it to be, and so I think
That
you might have
cannot be the reason why we leave people in prison.
No.
If we let them all out, great. Then we'll send them like
But I think-
straight to a school and
No,
rehabilitate them. But
What if you got convicted for a drug crime and then you were, I don't know, you were assaulting people in prison? You became a violent individual. I like the idea that you had a good
I
behavior
might be
while
violent.
in prison.
Well, hopefully not. But
I
like,
think-
who knows?
Of course. Why wouldn't you? You almost have to be violent. And that's one of the things actually. Well, that's one of the things that
Have
caught
you not
me
seen
about.
Orange is the New Black?
I mean, a lot of
That's
people
one
are
of
getting
the things
released,
that caught
though,
me
so.
about these requirements, because yes, you have to have good behavior in prison, but at the same time, if you're going to survive in prison, you probably have to.
I
you have
don't
to. You can't be a little sheep.
I mean,
you
look
have to
at
kind of puff your
what the
chest a little
sheriffs
bit.
themselves were doing to people.
A number of people have gotten released though, so people are making it through prison without
Like 1,000.
fighting their way through.
1,000.
We
which
don't
is
know
a
what
teeny
fraction.
tiny-
We don't know what,
Yeah.
and we know there's a large population of nonviolent offenders in this prison system.
I think if we got rid of the 10-year requirement, you'd see a lot more. I don't think it's
Yeah.
I don't think it's a good behavior part. I think it's the 10-year requirement.
Yeah,
So
I don't
I
like
think
that.
there are probably a lot of people who aren't.
But I agree
on.
that it does need to be coupled with, rehabilitation, education, things to help get these nonviolent
But the
offenders
fact
back
that we
on their
don't
feet.
have those programs yet shouldn't mean that people should have to stay in prison.
I still
Let's
want
put
to see.
you in there for a week and see how you like it.
Well, I don't know if I'd be a violent offender after. I do like to see that these people are being released and haven't had a violent history while in
but we
prison.
we know the collateral damage to the families, to the kids, how much it costs taxpayers.
So are you
It's just-
suggesting one of these offenders who had a violent history in prison, maybe beat up 10 prisoners a day, should be released? Is that what you're advocating?
beat up 10 people a day?
I'm just
Probably
saying-
not.
She's saying on balance.
But how about they get the same amount of time that these sheriff's deputies did? 5 months for beating somebody up. Let's make things really fair. But I would love nothing more than
Yeah.
Obama to sign a ginormous clemency act and then, save Standing Rock and then see, bye guys, I'm out of here. He would be my hero forever.
But I do think he's definitely going to do as much of these clemencies as possible. So,
Yeah,
but I
as
like having
possible.
some standards. Are good.
Okay, all right. So now an explanation to why I opened the show with saying we were going to cover an officer spaghetti brain, and that's because that was a term that Michael Slager used on the stand when he was testifying in his own defense on the Walter Scott killing. He said that during that experience, his mind was like spaghetti. However, he also testified that he kept shooting because that's what he was trained to do. So which one is it? Which one do you believe? That his mind was spaghetti, or he was doing as he was taught in training? Or both of these are a terrible excuse,
Right, I
and
mean,
you should just
that-
walk yourself to prison
That's
now.
my thing. I don't know how either of those is really a defense to shooting someone who's running away from you.
And I think he could have had some sort of mental blockage, but it doesn't mean that was a reasonable thing to do. So unfortunately, the way your mind worked, whether it's spaghetti or the way you were trained, it still should obtain you some jail time for what you've done.
Right. I don't think it's reasonable to fear for your life when someone is running away from you. Period.
Yeah,
Period,
And
period, period.
he's trying to say that the video that we've all seen that was taken by a bystander on a cell phone cam doesn't show the whole struggle. It doesn't give you the perspective of Slager's point of view. And to that, I'm like, I don't care. Is this,
With that
anybody
video,
else care?
Yeah.
I don't.
That video was pretty jarring, where it's like there's not really any other angles you need to see when
Right,
someone's several feet away running
Right.
away and you're shooting.
And even if there was a struggle, there was a tussle that happened 5 minutes earlier, 1 minute earlier, 2 minutes earlier, at the point in time in which he was shooting, the victim was running away from you.
Right.
So there is certainly a gap between that struggle and the time when this person is running away from you, where you kind of have the opportunity to collect your thoughts and know that this is not an appropriate use of force.
Right. And so he says that Scott reached for his taser, and somehow that means that when Scott was running away, he was still in fear for his life. It does not make any sense to me. It sounds like a whole lot of BS to me. And the only other thing that was said on the stand that really sent me over the edge was the testimony that was allowed about how the officer missed the birth of his son. There was this dramatic, line of questioning about how he and his wife had been trying to get pregnant and that they did IVF and that he wasn't there during the birth, and the attorney asks why not, and he takes a long pause. Instead, I was in jail, and the attorney clarifies, for this case, you mean? And he's like, yeah. That is totally irrelevant. I have no idea why that was let in at all.
Yeah.
That might go towards punishment, maybe, but that has no bearing on whether this was a murder or not. And it just seems to me a desperate attempt.
Or maybe that's why his brain was like spaghetti at the time.
Because his wife was pregnant?
Because they were trying to go through the IVF.
Oh, God.
I don't know. But yeah, I think he's got very poor defenses.
Yeah, I was waiting to see.
Yeah.
I was like, there's got to be something that we have not seen. But nope. He faces 30 years to life if convicted. And we shall see. I can't imagine how many more witnesses they're going to have. And then this should go to the jury pretty soon. And hopefully we'll have a guilty verdict to read to you all pretty soon.
Finally, for once, right?
Yeah.
In these officer
If that doesn't
involved
turn
shooting.
out, I'm going to be so pissed.
Or it'll just add to the count.
And there's another federal trial scheduled for next year. But still, I want this one to go well. All right. And then today it was announced that the officer who shot and killed Keith Lamont Scott will not be charged. This was a case of the guy who was sitting in the car. His family thought he was maybe even reading a book. And this whole issue came down to whether he was carrying a gun, which I actually think is the wrong issue to be looking at. But apparently 15 prosecutors agreed that the shooting was justified because there was credible evidence that there was a gun on the scene. Does this decision make sense to you?
I think once you believe that there was a gun on the scene, then it makes more sense. Yeah.
Okay, so fine. It makes more sense. But the question is not whether somebody has a gun, because remember, this is America. Everybody and anybody, basically, virtually, is allowed to have a gun. So having a gun in and of itself does not mean that somebody was in reasonable fear for their life or the life of somebody else. And that seems to be glossed over because everybody was so focused on whether or not there was a gun.
And they also mentioned that he had not been obeying police commands,
Yeah.
that they told him to drop the gun 10 times. They were giving him instructions and he wasn't following them. So I think in terms of the police
instructions
cam, the instructions in the police cam video wasn't super clear as to what Keith Lamont Scott was doing at the time he was shot down. It makes it at least understandable that reasonable minds might differ about what was reasonable in that circumstance.
I think he should have been charged. At the same time, I think they created a great narrative to say why he shouldn't be charged. I don't know if I necessarily believe the narrative, but what they have laid out is enough for me to say, okay, I understand why he's not charged.
And unfortunately, the family kind of played into the narrative about focusing on he didn't have a gun, a gun, because that is not the issue. He was not a reasonable threat. Yeah. That is the real issue. Somehow the family, at least according to the attorney that made this announcement, said that the family's been gracious and they somewhat accept it, but they still want to know more about what happened. They still have questions, and they want to know if there were police tactics of de-escalation that could have been used that could have prevented this death and maybe the death of somebody else. And I think it's a very valid question and valid thing to look into further.
Yeah, and I think that is probably one of the larger problems we have, is that there aren't de-escalation tactics, or they're only taken in certain communities and not others.
Right.
And so I think once you get to that point, that's where we have trouble, and so we need to find a way that.
Yeah, I hope that this this case doesn't die here.
Yeah.
No charges, and then everybody forgets about it. But there is still a problem, even if there were no charges.
Why did he lose his life? How could we have prevented that? Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's leave off on a very different kind of case, bringing it around back to Hollywood. A former TV host has sued for discrimination. She's suing because she doesn't have kids, basically. Is that the way that you read it, that this woman was fired from her hosting gig because she didn't have kids?
Well, it was that and a combination of several different things. Again, it was also her appearance. They thought her hair, which was I guess sort of like a bright red, and I think would be construed as more urban was too fiery for the show.
I like that use of terminology.
So,
How very PC of you.
and you know, they basically said it was Portia Coleman for Hollywood Today Live. They'd taken the series from an online series, and you know, they got picked up by a network, and they wanted her to make some certain changes. And they even, when she brought in her own hair and makeup person, they wanted her to hire a black person for the optics of it if they did some behind the scenes footage. So there was definitely elements to this case that are very troubling for, I believe it's Fox is one of the defendants.
Yeah. How do you think it's going to turn out?
Well, when courts take into account whatever directors or producers casting decisions, I mean, they have a lot of latitude in what they want to put on air. And
this is going to be tough.
Do courts want to decide what casting decisions are critical to the content and what what aren't? I mean, that's not really a position that I think courts, should really can feel comfortable mandating. And there's a question as to whether they should be mandating those types of casting decisions.
Yeah, and they brought in.
So I personally don't.
This is a really tough case, but she may have some grounds. I mean, if she was fired because she didn't appeal to moms because she wasn't one, and then nobody else on the panel was a mom.
Well, they brought in to replace her a mom.
A mom. But there were other people on the panel who were childless who got to stay.
Right, and
she was the casualty.
This is tough.
So we do know,
but I don't think she's going to do well in this case.
There's no protected class for being single and childless.
That's what I was asking. Is there a protected class for single women?
Usually that's the dream,
Are we a
right?
protected class?
All right, so wish her the
tough.
best, but I think that this is going to be an uphill battle.
I do think, especially because they made direct comments about her here in season 2, and if there's any pretext behind that, and if maybe being a mother was a pretext because they thought she looked a way that they found not appealing as a black woman, I think then there'll be some trouble.
If at worst, she gets a settlement.
Yeah, but they did replace her with another black female,
to go away.
so that's.
That's probably what's going to happen is that we will never know.
Yeah, but I did see the racial undertones in the case, and I think she probably has a lot of valid points.
Yeah, interesting case, though. Yeah. All right, so that brings us to the end of our very wide smorgasbord of varying cases this week. I hope you join us next week. In the meantime, like, comment, tweet at Chelsea Galicia.
You can find me at Shaka Strong on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat.
And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at @YemYems.
Join us again next week for another episode of Justice is Served. Bye, everyone.
From executives Keven Undergaro, Dario Kristen, Tiana Hobson, and the entire BHL staff, we would like to thank you for supporting Black Hollywood Live, the first online broadcast network dedicated to African American entertainment. For questions and comments, contact us. info@blackhollywoodlive.com. Like us on Facebook, tweet us, or Instagram us at BHL Online. And I am the official voice of Black Hollywood Live, Scipio. Instagram me at KingXOBay. Thanks for tuning in.
Hollywood Redefined.
The views expressed here are those of the host only and do not necessarily reflect the views of BHL or its owners or principals.